Hello, I'm Mark Thorsby. Welcome to Environmental Ethics. I hope you're doing well. Today what we're going to be talking about is Immanuel Kant's impact in environmental ethics, principally in his discussion of animals and animal cruelty. In particular, we're going to see that he's going to argue that we do actually have a moral relationship potentially with animals, but it's a moral relationship which is actually indirectly organized towards human beings. So at the end of the day, all of our moral actions for Kant are really about how we treat other human beings who are rational moral agents, which isn't animals per se, but he recognizes that if we become accustomed to treating animals cruelly, we eventually develop in us a moral character that is cruel towards human beings, which means that there is an indirect duty to non-humans in Kant's view, but it's anthropocentrically organized. Okay. Well, welcome back. I hope you're doing well. We're going to start off here by just talking a little bit about the basic elements of Immanuel Kant's philosophy. I've already posted a number of different video lectures on Immanuel Kant's overall ethical theory, but he's known as a deontologist. Deontology is the notion of a duty-based ethics, and Kant is going to argue that ultimately we have moral duties which determine whether or not our actions are wrong or right. These moral duties are articulated through an imperative, what he calls a categorical imperative. And this is a foundational moral principle that Kant has, which emphasizes the importance and centrality of reasoning, rationality, and autonomy when we're making decisions ethically and morally. And his work has really shaped moral philosophy all over the world. So it's an amazing ethicist. Now, if we take a look at Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy, we usually either take a look at a text he wrote called Groundwork to the Metaphysics of Morals, or to another text he wrote called The Critique of Practical Reasoning. But what we're actually going to be taking a look at here are his ideas that come from his lectures on ethics, which was actually sort of a little textbook he wrote for his own students, where he addressed a number of different questions that don't get addressed in the other text. And two of those questions are, what is our relationship, or what moral relationships or duties do we have towards animals? And the other one is, what moral duties do we have towards objects, which aren't animals at all, just inanimate objects per se. And we're going to look at both of those things today. Now, as we begin to talk about Kant, and we're talking about Kant in the context of his anthropocentric view that ultimately at the end of the day, in the center of moral life is the human being, and animals can sort of fall into that orbit. But we have to also recognize here that Kant's influence in modern ethics means that some of his basic views, which facilitate this perspective on the idea that animals are merely a means unto human beings, this facilitates part of the worldview we see in the modern world today. A couple of things that are important to note is that for Kant, rational beings, human beings who have the ability to reason, are ultimately ends in themselves. Kant asserts that rational beings have intrinsic moral worth, and they have to be treated as ends in themselves and never simply as a means. In fact, the second formula or the third formula for the categorical imperative oftentimes is called the humanity formula. And in that formula, Kant says that you should never treat another person simply as a means, but always as an end unto themselves. So this principle is foundational for understanding Kant's view about moral obligations with regard to animals. It's also worth mentioning a little bit about Kant's reasoning for this. Kant's view here is that the only way we can have access to morality is through reasoning, which means that the only people who could ever be considered categorically as falling under the auspices of morality have to therefore be rational agents. You can't expect your dog necessarily to use their reason to determine whether or not it's wrong or right to steal a bone, right? You can't really do that. We can train animals not to steal bones under threat of, punishment of some sort. But ultimately, they don't use reason to determine their actions, which means that it's only human beings really who are free to act one way or another because they're rational agents. So that means that rational beings are the moral ends themselves that we have to be concerned with. Now, this means that we're excluding non-rational beings from being direct morally valuable or having direct moral consideration. But this doesn't mean that there's no moral consideration ultimately. Kant will argue that, for instance, we should treat animals kindly, and he in fact gives an example where he talks about Leibniz, who was doing an experiment, picked up a worm and put the worm back on the leaf, and how that's good for our moral character. But we have to realize that, strictly speaking, we are excluding non-rational beings from moral consideration in a direct sense, but we will consider them in an indirect sense, because how we treat animals and how we treat the natural world does indeed affect other people. So this exclusion suggests a hierarchy in moral status, and this is really also important as we continue our discussion in environmental ethics, and we continue our discussion of anthropocentrism in particular. Now, we have this notion of a concept of indirect duties. I've already mentioned it, and Kant introduces this concept, and he states that our treatment of non-rational beings reflects our moral character. This means that cruelty or disregard for animals actually can corrupt us and corrupt the duties we do directly have towards each other. Now, the categorical imperative, let me talk a little bit more about that. This is Kant's supreme moral principle. And Kant's view here is that we use the categorical imperative in order to determine whether or not our actions themselves are rational. So in the first version of the categorical imperative, sometimes called the universalization test or the natural law formula, Kant argues we should always act in a way that through our will, we could actually will it to be a universal moral law. Or imagine, for instance, that your action, everyone else in the world was required to take that action when they're in your position. If everyone could, and it doesn't result in a contradiction, it's not paradoxical in some sort of way, then that would be a morally legitimate thing to do. But if your action results in a contradiction, that means your action is not rational. If it's not rational, it can't therefore be the right choice. And therefore, it would be morally wrong to do. So, for instance, lying would be the example. What if everyone was always required to lie whenever they were asked a question? Well, people would stop asking questions for the obvious reason that the reason we ask questions is to solicit the truth, true information. And if that was never the case, then clearly we wouldn't be communicating with each other. We wouldn't ask each other questions. So lying is always morally wrong because it's ultimately paradoxical. It's irrational. In the same way, we have to treat human beings who have rationality as moral agents, meaning that they have moral worth. And this also indicates in another version of his categorical imperative the importance that we have to recognize that there is an autonomy for different people, or not different people, but that we have to respect the autonomy of other moral agents. So nomos meaning mind. Autonomy is the idea that when other people are using their rational minds, we have to respect the decisions they make from that. So we have to respect the autonomy of differing people. Animals, by contrast, lack this rationality for Kant, which means that they don't have autonomy, which means that there's no respect for autonomy fortuitously, right? So this is known as the formula of autonomy. There's another formula called the community of ends, in which everyone should act in a way where we're all endorsing each other and our actions as rational agents. But again, always at the center of it for Kant is this notion of rationality. Now, he does assert that while animals and inanimate objects don't hold intrinsic moral value, our treatment of them does indeed matter, because we cultivate our character, our own personal character as rational agents, by how we treat other beings that exist in the world, including animals and non-living objects. And if we treat things carelessly, if we're cruel to animals or we waste animals, our use of them, then this actually impacts negatively our own personal moral sensibility. Now, this means that animals lack direct moral standing, you might say, but they are within the framework, but only within the framework in terms of them being in an indirect sense. So cruelty, Kant says, degrades human character. So human beings should avoid being cruel to animals. In the actual lectures and in the text, Kant refers to Hogarth's portraits on cruelty, so I thought I'd show you what they look like. These are supposed to be 4 stages of cruelty. You can see on the right-hand side is the first stage of cruelty, and this is where people are. It looks like there's people who are treating animals badly, They're being cruel to animals, you can see here. And then here's it gets worse. I think there's a boy in here who's holding the cat by its tail or something like this. And then the animal cruelty gets worse. And then eventually it begins to develop into torturing other people, vivisections, and then eventually just outright murder. So Kant's view here is that ultimately, that if you begin, that people, when they start being cruel to animals and they show this sort of wanton cruelty, what happens is they develop in their moral character a degradation such that eventually they'll start doing really horrible things. In fact, we know that most serial killers actually, when they're children, torture animals. So there is a link here between the idea of habituating cruelty towards animals and seeing that jump over and leap over into a cruelty towards other human beings. So that means that there is an indirect duty towards humanity that we have to recognize. Kant writes, so far as animals are concerned, we have no direct duties. Animals are not self-conscious and are there merely as a means to an end. That end is man. We can ask, why do animals exist? But to ask why does man exist is a meaningless question. Our direct duties towards animals are merely indirect duties towards humanity. So that means that, and I think we should recognize here is that on the one hand, Kant is articulating the position which probably forms the foundation for our basic approach in understanding what animal rights are in a sort of legal sense are today. Animals, for instance, are the property of their owners, but there are rights protecting animals from being tortured, for instance, in most states and in most countries throughout the world. Why is this? How can an object both be property to be used, including to eat, but then have a limitation? And why is there a limitation on how you can treat those animals? The answer comes from the Kantian lens here, which is namely we have an indirect duty towards humanity accordingly. So that means that there is a moral significance for the treatment of animals, at least on Kant's view and along Kantian lines. Cruelty towards animals not only harms those animals, but it cultivates habits that lead to a lack of compassion towards other human beings. And this therefore fostering kindness toward animals is not just ethical, but it's actually essential for nurturing our own humanity and moral sensibility. Kant writes, tender feelings towards dumb animals develop humane feelings towards mankind. Now, one last thing I want to talk about here is what about inanimate objects? Now, we've been talking about animals and living substances, but think about this, is that when we talk about environmental ethics, we're also concerned with the degree to which we can think about the environment overall. So, for instance, think about mining for minerals and things of this sort, or for mining for minerals or transforming ecosystems and landscapes, where you're not directly injuring this or that animal, but you are changing, and human beings have a relationship towards the inanimate objects in nature and in the world. So what's Kant's view on this, and how does this relate to it? Well, number one is he thinks that just wantonly destroying things is morally wrong. Really on the same grounds that we say that animals shouldn't be tortured or treated cruelly, namely that we have a direct moral duty to other human beings, and part of that direct moral duty is to develop our character. If we become callous and we just wantonly just destroy things, he says that this actually damages our moral character. So he's ultimately towards this idea that we need to avoid destructive behavior, and we need to, because such behavior cultivates a disregard for others, and it fosters a type of callousness that can be directed towards other human beings. Likewise, respect for treating inanimate objects develops moral character, right? By treating objects with care, individuals can develop habits of respect that translate ultimately into the better treatment of people. So Kant's basic view here is the same with animals. The difference, though, is that we're talking about in terms of just being foolishly destructive of things is morally wrong under Kant's view. So that means that we have to think about things like the impact of neglect with Kant. just neglecting our natural environment or creating conditions where our own neglect leads to the destruction of the environment in a sort of reckless way would be morally wrong on Kant's view. And we have to recognize that there is an importance for respecting animals and respecting the natural world on Kant's view. But again, any sort of respect or duty to not neglect things, or a duty for sustainability or something like this on Kant's view ultimately is going to be anthropocentric, because at the core of Kant's moral framework is the view that human beings are at the center, and by human beings we mean rational moral agents. Only rational agents can make decisions and can make choices, as it were, in Kant's view. Animals are simply reacting to their environments, and they lack rationality, and because they lack rationality, they don't fit within Kant's moral universe, not in a direct sense, but they do within an indirect sense. So Kant's philosophy here can help provide us an important starting point for thinking about environmental ethics and animal rights in particular. But it's also a showcase for us of the anthropocentrism that's at the core of virtually all of the moral approaches we see towards the natural environmental world today. So on the one hand, we can be critical of Kant because we see that Kant doesn't want to say that animals have intrinsic moral value in themselves, and therefore we're allowed to eat them and do what we want with them. But Kant also wants to limit those activities towards what's rational, also in terms of developing our own moral character and making us good persons. So if we're to sort of ask the question of how does this all relate, we would say ultimately moral character matters. Number two, the indirect duties towards animals in the natural world also for Kant impact humanity, and therefore we have to also be thinking about how we treat the natural world. Moral life, though, on Kant's view, at the end of the day, is a uniquely human state of affairs. And he really says we got to keep it within those confines. In fact, at one point in the reading, Kant even talks about the idea that human beings should not get involved with communicating with spirits, which seems very weird to us. But again, it's sort of an emphasis that for Kant, the moral world is something that only exists within the rational human community. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this video has been interesting and has given you a summary and a basic understanding for what Kant's ethical framework is and how it relates to this notion that we have indirect duties to non-humans.